successful in seeing their tasks through. Of course, also on this improvement agenda was the name change that has made the Association of Business for Cole Harbour the name change. I'm sorry. Mr. Speaker, I wish to congratulate the Association on a great full year of full events and successful strategies that will allow them to continue to improve the business in Cole Harbour, Portland Valley area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those member statements. Just want to take one more further opportunity to remind people when they're reading member statements not to address folks directly, and also not to use member statements as any type of commercial endorsement or commercial for the topic of your statement. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. This week, the Premier informed the House that he has sent auditors into Northwood to prove that his cuts are making them feed our senior residents there at a total of $5.12 a day for 3 meals, Mr. Speaker. But of course we know this is not a situation unique to Northwood. Most of the nursing homes across this province have had the same cuts as Northwood and are being forced to feed their senior residents on the same amount or even less. So I'd like to ask the Premier, will he acknowledge that his cuts, in fact, affect most of the nursing homes of the province, not just Northwood?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we had 4 executive directors of 4 different nursing homes across the province. They very clearly told all Nova Scotians that the changes in the funding model did not affect food. What the Honourable Member said it has across this province is that they clearly said it has not affected the quality of food, and they also said, Mr. Speaker, the changes have had no impact on their residents.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, quite the opposite. They were here yesterday because they're very concerned about the effect the Premier's cuts are going to have on their residents, including food, Mr. Speaker. Nursing homes are dealing with his budget cuts both last year and this year, and seniors are being forced to eat on $5 a day, and in some cases less, Mr. Speaker. But the Premier's answer to that is not to restore the funding for our seniors, but rather, if a nursing home complains, to send in the auditors instead, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, since we know this is happening across the province, what other nursing homes does he plan to send auditors into instead of helping our seniors?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, it was very clearly said by the 4 executive directors that were here that the changes were not impacting seniors, Mr. Speaker, and it's unacceptable that a member of this House would go around using seniors as pawns for political purposes. It is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, and we've made it clear, Mr. Speaker, we made it clear to all of those nursing homes that there's issues related to delivering those services, to contact our government. We continue to work for them, and I was pleased yesterday to have them say there was no impact, Mr. Speaker, in delivering those services to their residents. What they were concerned about, Mr. Speaker, was next year and going forward, and we're continuing to reach out with them and work with them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is a farce. Nobody comes to this House. The Premier knows it full well. Nobody comes to this House to say everything is hunky-dory. That is not the reason that the nursing home representatives were here yesterday. They're very worried about the effect of his cuts. In fact, what they're saying, what we're saying, what Nova Scotians are saying is what's unacceptable is telling our seniors they have to eat 3 meals a day on $5.12. Only the Premier thinks that's okay and is asking for auditors to prove otherwise. I don't know what he wants to see, Mr. Speaker. Does he want proof that they're getting skinnier? Does he want proof there's no one to take them to church on Sunday? Why doesn't he end this charade right now, Mr. Speaker? I call on the Premier, put that funding back in.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member is using false information, Mr. Speaker. He knows full well yesterday those executive directors were here, said there was no impact on food quality, no impact on service being delivered to seniors, Mr. Speaker. What they did say, they raised an issue, Mr. Speaker, about on a go-forward basis what this would mean to them. The Minister of Health has been reaching out, talking to them and working with them, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue, Mr. Speaker, to make sure seniors are a priority in this province and not a political pawn like the member across the aisle is using that.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, students returning to universities across this province last month to an increased debt load. Data released by the Maritime Provinces Higher Education Commission showed students in Nova Scotia have faced the largest increase in fees since the government took office on capping the tuition. In fact, the tuition fees are increasing more rapidly than anywhere else in the country under this government. So I asked the Premier, this is at a time where Nova Scotians really need to attract and retain more young people. So again, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier, is he proud of this government's decision to increase the debt load on students who are already strapped for cash?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as he would know, has been in place a Nova Scotia bursary for Nova Scotia students at about $1,200 a year. He would also know, under the leadership of Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, one of the first things he did is remove interest off of student debt. You would also know for Nova Scotians who finish their degree, Mr. Speaker, in 4 years in this province, we forgive the Nova Scotia portion of the student loan.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, other provinces are taking action to reduce the debt load on post-secondary students. Provincial governments in both Ontario and New Brunswick are taking action to eliminate tuition. In Ontario, the work is being done to ensure that students and families with incomes under $50,000 will have no provincial student debt. And in New Brunswick, tuition will soon be free for students from low-income and middle-class families. Meanwhile, this government is forcing thousands of students in this province farther in the rate, and I'll table those documents. So I asked the Premier, why has the government decided to burden students with debt when there are ways to make post-secondary education more affordable from the very start?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to again tell him that any Nova Scotia student who completes a degree in 4 years, Mr. Speaker, their entire Nova Scotia portion of that student loan will be forgiven, Mr. Speaker. It also Speaker, Nova Scotians who with a disability have up to 10 years, Mr. Speaker, to finish their degree, and their student debt would be forgiven, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with students. We've worked with the private sector to provide those job opportunities to those students in here. As he would know, or he should know, this province is leading the country per capita in retaining our young people. Population is up, retaining youth, Mr. Speaker. Job opportunities here because the private sector provided them. And, Mr. Speaker, we're making sure that when students graduate in this province, their student debt is looked after.
The Honourable Leader in the House, the New Democratic Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this government ignored the post-secondary education biggest detractors, high tuition fees and student debts. Only the NDP government has a plan to make, or party has made a plan to make university and college more affordable in Nova Scotia. For example, the NDP will soon introduce legislation that will eliminate tuition at Nova Scotia's community college. This would address a major funding gap for community college students where there are less support and programs to address student debts. So I asked the Premier, will he take the first step to making post-secondary education more affordable by supporting the NDP's effort to eliminate tuition at the Nova Scotia community colleges?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. What the honourable member has not told the House or Nova Scotians is how he's going to pay for that, Mr. Speaker. The last time they were in power, they cut $65 million out of classrooms across this province. Is that where you're going to find the money?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. It's pretty obvious this week, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is getting annoyed and frustrated when people question him about the cuts he's made to our nursing homes. No wonder, Mr. Speaker, he got caught. He was hoping that no one would mention it. But then Northwood spoke up, and now other nursing homes are speaking up about the devastating effects his cuts are having on our senior residents, including their food budget, Mr. Speaker. And when he got caught, instead of doing the right thing by our seniors and putting the funding back in place, he calls in the auditors, Mr. Speaker. No wonder that nursing homes are afraid to come here and speak their mind about what's going on when that's the reaction they get from this Premier. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, are other nursing homes going to have auditors called in now because they have spoken up against his cruel budget cuts?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member should know when Northwood raised the concern, they came to a government, we went in, we looked at them. There was a difference in numbers, Mr. Speaker. You should also know that Northwood not only is a not-for-profit, but it as a for-profit part of its operation. They agreed to have the auditor come in, Mr. Speaker. They agreed on who that was. We were going in to look at those numbers. I think any reasonable person, when there's a dispute between us, not automatically accepting we're right. We're going in to let the third party to look at that, and we'll continue to work with Northwood. I have heard, Mr. Speaker, from 4 executive directors yesterday who said there was no impact on food quality and no impact on the residents, and that honourable member should perhaps listen to the frontline people delivering services, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, to be perfectly blunt, the residents of nursing homes do not care whether they are profit or not-for-profit nursing homes. They just want a decent meal 3 times a day, Mr. Speaker. Is that too much to ask? They don't care how many auditors the Premier sends to their nursing home, Mr. Speaker. They just want to eat a healthy, nutritious meal. They want the dignity of a reasonable retirement, and he has taken that away by cutting the funding to those homes, Mr. Speaker, and watching as our seniors eat on $5.12 a day. No auditor is going to change that fact. So will the Premier end this auditor charade and put the funding back in so our seniors living in nursing homes, for profit or not, get the dignity that they deserve?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the executive directors of 4 nursing homes were here and disputing the very thing the ministers or the members talking about. It's absolutely not correct, Mr. Speaker. They said it has not impacted food quality, has not impacted, Mr. Speaker, the fact the service of what they
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
They did say, Mr. Speaker, they're concerned about what happens next year, Mr. Speaker. As we've said, the Minister of Health is reaching out to those nursing homes. We're working with them. And he also should know, Mr. Speaker, that the issue around the auditor, Mr. Speaker, is related to a difference of opinion between government and instead of automatically assuming we were right, Mr. Speaker, we brought a third party in that was agreed on to both sides to make sure we get to the bottom of it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Teachers from across the province are telling me they are tired of the Liberal spin, spin, spin. They tell me the minister's action plan is a no-starter, and they have shared their frustrations with Power School Gradebook and Tienet. Teachers are held accountable for inputting students' grades in a faulty system, although many teachers find themselves giving up in frustration when the system repeatedly tells them the following page has become unresponsive. You can wait till the page becomes responsive or choose to kill it. So my question for the minister is this. Will the minister please tell this House what she is planning to do to improve teachers' working conditions? Will she remove her action plan and reduce data entry for the 9,000 frustrated teachers who are tired of having to constantly hit the kill option on the Power School Gradebook?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I would be proud to tell the House, folks in the gallery who I believe understand this, and all Nova Scotians, that when we formed government in 2013, we inherited a mess. We inherited 4 years of cuts to education. And Mr. Speaker, we began to listen to teachers then. And teachers said to us they wanted smaller class sizes, and we began to implement those. They told us they wanted a more manageable curriculum. We brought teachers from the classroom in to help develop that. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we have demonstrated that we have listened. Are there still concerns that teachers have? Absolutely. Are we listening to teachers? Are we providing a forum for that to happen? Absolutely.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as somebody who should be proud of being a public school teacher, it's interesting she does not include that in her bio on the government website. Instead, she has principal and supervisor. Another frustration I often hear from teachers is that the current business model of education doesn't work. Teachers want to be able to spend time building a class community that feels safe and engaging for our students. They were not trained to be data crunchers. That's not who they want to be. It's not who the students need them to be. And I highly doubt it's what parents want them to be when they send their children to school. As education critic, it's my belief we need to move towards a model where decisions about classrooms are based on local needs, not driven by a dubious data collection system. So my question for the minister is, does she agree that her government's business model for education means that teachers are forced to spend more time doing data collection than taking care of the diverse needs of students and doing what teachers do best?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in response to the question, I'm really proud to say that I'm a teacher. You don't become a principal until you've been a teacher, and I would think people would understand that. However, having said that, I do want to say that we will continue to listen. I think our budgets for the last 3 years have demonstrated that. For 4 years, there were budget cuts by the NDP. The member speaking sat on our hands and did nothing but support those budgets. Mr. Speaker, when teachers were protesting, they went to her office.
Order, please. The honourable member, Minister of Education, has the floor.
It's my understanding, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The honourable Minister of Education has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it's...
Order, please. The honourable Minister of Education has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that when teachers were protesting those cuts under the NDP government and they went to the member opposite's office, she had not reported to work that day.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, teachers, parents and students will be watching the potential upcoming meetings on classroom improvements. We all want to see meaningful results to come from these meetings. My question to the Minister, is the first meeting scheduled, and when can Nova Scotians expect questions from classroom teachers to be addressed or answered?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. When the invitation went to the teachers' union, to the president, from me to the president, Doucette, it was an invitation for the three partners to sit down and talk about a forum where teachers' concerns could be heard. I was very pleased to have that favourable response from the teachers' union, and in the response there was an agreement that we would look at dates to have our first meeting. When that is announced, I'd be glad to share it with the member opposite.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, many teachers have freely explained the numerous frustrations they face each day in the classroom. I've had the opportunity to speak with many teachers across the province. My question to the Minister, will the Minister commit to also meeting with classroom teachers to discuss the working conditions they are facing in their classrooms?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to say that I've spoken to teachers on Monday, on Tuesday of this week. I've arranged opportunities to go into classrooms. Teachers have invited me to go in, and I've accepted that invitation. That will happen. And I do want to say to members in the House here that we're not only asking teachers to identify their concerns, we're asking them to help us with solutions.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Public Service Commission. On Tuesday, October 18th, a posting for a permanent position of Associate Deputy Minister appeared on a Career Beacon, a job posting website. The closing date for this six-figure job is only 7 days later, on October 25th. So my question to the Minister is simple. Is it fair to post a government job for just 1 week?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, as you can appreciate, I don't check the job postings of the Public Service Commission, but I'd be more than happy to look into that one and get back to the member.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, the minister responsible should know what the rules are. I just asked, is it fair to post that job for 1 week? A six-figure job with 1 week competition sounds real familiar, Mr. Speaker. That's the process that landed Marilla Stevenson her job as Managing Director of Corporate and External Relations. Maybe that's the process this government has adopted to ensure the person the government wants wins the competition. So my question is, did an insider write the job description for the position of Associate Deputy Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Marilla Stevenson for the wonderful work she's doing implementing the One Nova Scotia report. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this past summer, Nova Scotia
Order, please.
had a...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Internal Services has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, this past summer, Nova Scotia had a record year in tourism, something that every member and every Nova Scotian can be proud about. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank everybody who's working on the One Nova Scotia report, everyone who's having a positive outlook in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, I wish the opposition could have a positive outlook like the rest of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. It's alarming to hear about the spike in opioid overdoses in Nova Scotia this year, which to date has already claimed around 70 lives, Mr. Speaker. The CEO of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Nova Scotia has stated that as this problem grows, there is simply not enough doctors working in addiction medicine. He also said there's a need for more counselling services, as well as a greater focus, Mr. Speaker, on education and intervention. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what is he doing to address the growing problem of opioid overdose in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that important question that he's bringing to the floor of the legislature today. We've taken a proactive approach in terms of even a potential coming storm with fentanyl, carfentanil. And so about 4 weeks ago, I started speaking to first the Deputy Minister to arrange a meeting of the College, Doctors Nova Scotia, and others who can map out a more comprehensive plan. Met with Doctors Nova Scotia yesterday. We all realize that 85 doctors who do some replacement therapy is simply not enough, and we'll now map out a plan over the next few weeks so that Nova Scotians know exactly what kind of helps and support are out there.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My concern is that the government hasn't acted quickly enough, Mr. Speaker. There are overdoses happening daily, Mr. Speaker, weekly here in our province, and we know from reports that this was coming to our province. Yesterday, I asked the Minister about the possible closure of the Ally Centre in Cape Breton because of federal funding cuts to that facility, Mr. Speaker. However, there was not a lot of suggestions on or an answer from the government on what they're going to do. The Ally Centre is one, as I said yesterday, of only 2 sites in the province piloting the program to distribute naloxone anti-overdose kits. So I'd like to ask the Minister again, what is he doing to ensure the Allied Centre in Cape Breton will not have to shut its doors?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An important question as well, and that is a program that I've observed in action, and one very valuable for those vulnerable citizens of the province. We know that the Ally Centre has lost its federal grant. In fact, we've reached out to the federal government to see about seeing it restored. They've given considerable help to British Columbia, and Nova Scotia will expect equity in terms of supporting the centre, and next week we'll review not just a short-term need but the long-term need of that centre.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday night, more than 150 people gathered in Weymouth to discuss the severe doctor shortage in that part of the province. Many of the people shared their stories of fear, frustration, and tragedy. One woman told the crowd she lost her baby because the health services she needed were not available close to her home. The people gathered in Weymouth Tuesday night feel betrayed by the Liberal promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is, how long will the people of Weymouth have to wait before the Minister acts to ease the stress and suffering of all those who don't have a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for King South, who asked again a question that is being addressed. We know that many small communities in the province will find it, in fact, impossible to attract someone who wants to practice as a solo physician these days. So moving those patients in Weymouth to the collaborative clinic in Clare as well as Digby indeed has met with some challenges because attracting doctors to Digby over the last number of years. In fact, we're now into a second decade where they've had a deficiency of physicians. But I'm pleased to say that we currently have many of the patients from Weymouth now going to Clare. A new locum has started in Digby. 2 nurse practitioners have started at the Digby Collaborative Practice. It will take a little time to meet all of the needs, but we are well underway.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Clare Digby told the crowd at the meeting there is a position open for a physician in Weymouth, but no doctor wanted to come and live in that community. The warden and health authorities corrected the member and said no doctor would come because there wasn't a position in Weymouth to fill. A newspaper account of the meeting, which I'll table, says the member for Clare Digby told the audience he had convinced the minister to approve a doctor to work in Weymouth if one could be found. My question for the minister is this. The people of Weymouth deserve a straight answer. Who is right, the member for Clare Digby or the Health Authority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And probably there's been no issue over the past year that I've actually received up-to-the-minute information on. The member for Clare Digby, I don't know whether he's checking on me Sunday mornings, but he checks in Sunday morning with an information update on the situation. He has answered many, many calls from the residents to give them that assurance that a plan is unfolding, and what I can tell the member opposite that we will see, in fact, some very, very good news to address Weymouth's situation. There are many communities the same way. One in my riding of Aylesford, with an 83-year-old doctor, are seeing the last days of a family practitioner who has given unbelievable service to that community. But in the future, they will go to Berwick or Kingston.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community Culture and Heritage. The Northside Soccer Association, headed by Angela Hull and Sandy Cantwell-Kerr, was successful in winning the Craft Project Play Contest for $250,000 to upgrade to the Monroe Park soccer field. This contest brought a whole Cape Breton community together. CBRM and ACOA ended up with over $200,000. We applied for money from the province of Nova Scotia. 2 letters, 4 applications later, and we were told that we were past the deadline. It was too late. This process started in September of 2015, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister tell these good people if any money will be made available to complete this project this year?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I'd like to say that we at our department look at all those community organizations and welcome any applications from any of those community organizations. My staff have met with those individuals and have communicated with them. We will, in the future year coming for the next application, submit the asset organization to submit that application. My staff and department will be willing to work with them and move everything forward. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, I started that process back in September 2015 last year. I sent 2 letters, I asked questions in the legislature, and I passed in 4 applications that were either lost or misplaced. Mr. Speaker, when they finally got the application, I was told the application system was too late. So my question is, if it's not going to be done this year, do we have to reapply or will it be put in the queue automatically?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Well, thank you. First of all, the group that had submitted the paperwork that you are referring to, or documents, it was a proposal and it wasn't a full application. So I asked them to send in the application and our staff will work with them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Justice. The Ontario government has been under pressure to reform its use of solitary confinement following reports of poor conditions at correctional centres. Just this week, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has said that there's an alarming and systemic overuse of segregation in the province's jails, and I will table that. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is I'd like to ask the Minister, does she have any concerns about the use of segregation in jails here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member opposite has raised a very important question, and one that, again, 60 seconds doesn't allow for a good answer to. I think all of us are concerned about the impacts around segregation or closed confinement in our correctional facilities. We're certainly very aware of it in terms of mental health concerns, and our correctional facilities and staff are working to change some of the procedures that we have, or some of the opportunities to help people with mental illness.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our caucus has been trying to get information from the Department of Justice about the use of segregation in Nova Scotia jails. However, we have been informed through a letter from the department that it does not track the total time a person spends in segregation, nor does it provide any breakdown of how many inmates are there due to disciplinary reasons or safety issues. If there is no tracking, then this would appear to be an apparent lack of oversight by her department. So I ask the Minister, if the department is lacking such critical information on the use of segregation, how does the Minister know whether or not there are issues that need to be addressed?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I know that when there was a snapshot taken on a single day, it was 3% of the offenders that were in our institutions that were in either closed confinement or segregation. And the reasons for that, Mr. Speaker, are varied. They're absolutely wide. Sometimes, and I admit it's not the majority of times, it's because the individual asks. Sometimes it's for their own protection. Sometimes it's because of disciplinary action. But it isn't taken lightly. It is the very last resort. There are other things that can be done first. And one thing I think that's very positive is we are working with the federal government, and it is in the federal minister's mandate to look at segregation. And as part of that, we have reduced the days from 15 to 10 that can be allowed on a regular basis.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have hundreds of constituents without a doctor. This past month, a constituent reached out to me with a heartbreaking story. A young woman and her husband were expecting. However, her pregnancy became unviable with a molar pregnancy, which required immediate surgery, which then discovered that she had cancer. She's gone through months of chemo. She is going through this whole ordeal without a doctor, despite my desperate and repeated efforts to work with the health authority. Given this woman's circumstances, does the health minister believe it's good enough for me to give her a 1-800 number and wait? Because I certainly don't think it's good enough.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Pictou West for that question. As the member knows, Pictou had the unfortunate death of a doctor. Also, doctors, as they are in the last years of their practice, closed the walk-in clinic at Sutherland Memorial. So we had a number of quick developing events take place in Pictou. As she knows, we are currently working to establish a further practice, and certainly one of the new nurse practitioners will be going to that community for primary care.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the health authority needs to take into consideration those who have life-threatening medical conditions. Waiting 5-10 years with 100,000 people in this province waiting for a doctor is unacceptable when you have a condition that needs to be monitored every week. I'd like to know if the minister here today will stand and help me find this young lady a doctor.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, because there are those very, very challenging circumstances that come up. I've handled a number personally, reached out to Nova Scotians. In fact, another one recently in the member's riding. And what I can tell the member opposite, the first call will be made before noon today.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Wait lists for mental health for young adolescents has once again taken a sharp increase in Nova Scotia. Access to mental health care has been an issue in this province for far too long, and it's now always disappointing to see when the wait times grow even larger. Province-wide wait times have more than doubled for access to service in communities, and I'll table that document. Will the minister now admit that there's a crisis in mental health care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I can say that when I arrived here, in fact, even for many years, we had a wait list of over 900 at the IWK. As the member knows, we have now dramatically reduced the wait list for the more intensive services. And as the member knows, we're building capacity across the province. And yesterday, with the Stronger Families announcement, extra money for that program, we'll have 3,500 families that will receive that coaching with their adolescent children. We are getting marvelous results from it. We'll continue to work to improve mental health services for youth, and especially that transitional group of 19 to 25, which are a challenge in all of our provinces.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
You know, Mr. Speaker, that chart basically has wait times that are almost off that chart. Trends like this are not new to Nova Scotians who are trying to navigate the mental health system. This is not the way to handle mental health care and delivery in the province, regardless of their age. We have a lot to do, and this minister needs to step up a lot more than what he's been doing. Long waits for mental health services can end in tragedy, and we've talked about some of those things here in the House of Assembly, and I know we as MLAs have heard it far too often in our communities. So will the minister table his plans to address all mental health cases within acceptable time periods before the end of the fall session?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member today is that I've had the first draft from the mental health panel that we established in the spring. I asked for a very, very short number of recommendations, ones that we could implement very quickly, and under the guidance and work of the co-chairs, Dr. Stan Kuchar and Starr Dobson, the first area that they've highlighted is our school system. And I'm pleased to say that when I met on Tuesday with a side meeting with the federal minister to take a look at, through the Accord, additional funding for mental health resources for our school system, and I hope to be able to say very soon that there will be results coming from that approach.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier, when he sat on this side of the House as opposition leader, told Nova Scotians that he would have an open and transparent government if they were given the chance to govern. Since August, we've been trying to obtain from the Minister of Health, from the Department of Health, the total cuts that long-term care facilities had over the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker. The Minister continues to add and add to the list of cuts that happen, and indicated yesterday in the answer to a question a couple of different streams of funding would be affected by the 1% cut. So I want to ask the minister, would he provide the House the total amount of funding that was cut to each long-term care facility and not require the opposition to pay for that information through Freedom of Information?
The Honourable the Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. In the Health Department, we provide members opposite and Nova Scotians with the facts. And if he'd like a more concise, I guess, picture with two numbers added together, I'm more than prepared to provide him with that.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
That's what we asked for in August, Mr. Speaker. That's what we asked for in August. It's not very difficult. How much was Northwood cut? How much was St. Vincent's Guest Home cut? How much was Oakwood Terrace cut, Mr. Speaker? We just want to see how much these facilities were cut. This government cut millions of dollars from long-term care facilities across the province over the last few years. And yesterday, the minister said that this last week they started to reach out to those nursing homes to find out how they were handling those cuts, the reductions, and what were the challenges, Mr. Speaker. Is this really the minister's plan for long-term care in Nova Scotia, to make cuts and then ask questions later?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We realize that with some of the consolidation that we did through the One Health Authority, especially around procurement, better use of human resources, shared resources in some cases, that we've in fact have a higher quality of work being done both in the Health Authority and with our delivery service across the province. We anticipated that we could do much the same with nursing homes who have operated their 132 facilities very independently. Now it is time to take a look and get from the lessons learned. I've been in about 60% of our nursing homes. Many have been able to look after the 2% cut, but we will take a look at those that have some needs and address them very quickly.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. The film industry in Nova Scotia is suffering. However, the Deputy Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage stated, anecdotally, the film industry is doing well. In fact, though, Mr. Speaker, the Directors Guild of Canada has shown its Nova Scotia members have made $2.8 million less in 2015 after the film tax credit was suddenly cut. When will the minister recognize that the film industry is in disarray and cutting the film tax credit was a mistake?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
I thank my colleague for the question. First of all, the creative industries is growing. Film is just one part of the creative industries. I cannot speak to the specifics around film, so if you would like to have some direct answers to film, I would ask you to speak to the Minister of Business. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will remind the Minister that his department is directly related with the film industry as well as the Department of Business, so I'm open to whoever wants to answer the next question. The Deputy Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage claims the industry is rebounding. However, the Directors Guild of Canada said fewer productions, a westward migration of workers and a complicated new incentive fund are to blame. In addition, they say that NSBI new incentive fund is too time-consuming to attract new business and takes too long to deliver necessary funds, and I can table that. So when will the minister admit that it was a mistake to cut the film tax credit and take action to help the struggling film industry and bring jobs back to Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. It gives us the opportunity to speak to the growth that the industry has experienced most recently, Mr. Speaker. My colleague knows that we've worked very close with the industry to find those issues of concerns. Over the past 18 months, we have come to what I believe are solutions in advancing the Film Television Production Incentive Fund. To date, Mr. Speaker, we have 38 productions that have been approved. We just recently, Mr. Speaker, increased the budget for the fund by $1.5 million because of the uptake in the fund, Mr. Speaker. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we just approved a $6 million investment in the production Mist, the largest single production ever in the province of Nova Scotia. So things are going very well in the film industry.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of the Environment. For the last 3 years, residents of Manitow Lake have been dealing with a terrible algae bloom problem, Mr. Speaker. Their lake literally turns deep green. The toxicity of the algae bloom has been proven at testing at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College in Bible Hill. All of this has been shared repeatedly with the Minister's department. but the department and the minister herself have admitted they don't have the expertise to deal with this problem, Mr. Speaker. This is a problem at Manitow Lake today, but it could be your lake, anywhere in the province at some point in the future, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister of the Environment now, what steps has she taken to acquire the expertise at her department to help the residents of Manitow Lake deal with their algae bloom and other lakes around our province who may face similar problems in the future?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. Hey, this is a very important issue, and certainly to many residents around Nova Scotia who do have lakes. Manitow Lake is not rare. This is something that's you're going to see happening more and more around our province, and it can be a result of many factors, including higher temperatures. And what we're doing is encouraging the groups to form, and in this case especially, to form a watershed protection committee, so we can look at what the real source is of the additives in the water that promote the algae bloom.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the answer, but the residents of Manitow Lake are going to be wondering exactly who the minister means by we, because her department has completely abrogated its responsibilities to the volunteer residents themselves. Yes, they formed a stewardship association, and yes, the department gave them $10,000 and then told them to find an expert in the United States to help them deal with the problem. Well, that's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have a Department of the Environment, to help people that have these issues with the environment, like at Manitow Lake, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the minister, will she assure the residents of Manitow Lake today that her department will take responsibility for getting to the root of the problem and helping them clean up Manitow Lake?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. That's certainly, we have never said to the residents of Manitow Lake that it's their problem and they have to deal with it. We realize that this is an ongoing problem and it could be affecting any lake in Nova Scotia. I believe, I'm not sure if the number is exactly right, but it's 2,400 lakes in Nova Scotia, and certainly to expect government to monitor all those lakes and control the quality in those lakes is not realistic for the citizens of Nova Scotia. I have met with the residents of Manitow Lake. We continue to meet with them. My department continues to meet with them, and we will come up with a solution that works for all of us.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, there is a desperate need for more and better quality affordable housing, particularly in Halifax Needham, where rents and prices have increased significantly in the last 10 years. Monday was the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and I met with constituents struggling to find housing. 2 of them are living in a shelter and receiving the shelter allowance of $78 a month. I asked the Minister of Community Services, what hope can you give to income assistance recipients currently living in shelters that there is a pathway for them towards affordable and adequate housing?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, and I thank the member for the question. This government, and in fact the previous government, started under the previous government, supports a shelter transition community support worker in the shelters in Halifax Needham, and they have helped people find affordable housing within, whether it's Needham or the rest of the peninsula or in Dartmouth. Between the 20-block area between Cogswell and North End Halifax, there are 1,683 social housing units. There's 15 more than there were a couple of weeks ago, because we've actually taken over the mortgages for the Brunswick Street nonprofit housing, so that we wouldn't lose those units within the Halifax Needham. So there are many tools within the toolbox of affordable housing, and we'll be making announcements in the coming weeks.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, at that same meeting with constituents, I heard about some really abysmal living conditions inside some of those metro regional housing facilities, and I'd like to ask the Minister for an update on how they're going to address problems like bed bugs, mice and rat infestations, and other problems.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to say within the last 3 years, we've actually invested an additional $42 million into affordable housing that was sitting in a deferred contribution fund that actually her government previously didn't spend a penny of. Part of that $42 million, yes, it is. Part of that $42 million.
I'd like to remind everybody to keep their comments directed through the chair. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite clearly knows that nothing was spent from the deferred federal contribution under her government, and part of the money that was part of that $42 million went into renovations. We've had extraordinary success in the remediation of bed bugs and pest control. We have invested extra money in public housing, both in Dartmouth, in Uniacke Square, in Mulgrave Park, and in Greystone. We have tenant associations that are lively and vibrant. We have provided rent supplements. We have reduced the wait list in this province by 10%, the first time in a decade.
The Honourable House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I attempted to address the issue of at-home cancer medication to the Minister of Health. And as we know, the Minister has committed to look at this closer. He has put in some money aside. So my question to the Minister, that will he commit to the people that have to go to hospital for cancer treatment, that have to travel from our communities, from Yarmouth, from Sydney, for specialty work here in Halifax, that might be available to oral at-home cancer treatments. Will he commit, through you, Speaker, will he commit to funding at-home cancer treatments once and for all?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I first of all have to say I'm very disappointed that the member waited until the last moments of the House today. This is a question that very important to me as Minister. It's one that I believe our first explorations are providing, I think, some path forward. What I can tell the member very quickly is that we continue to look at how can we move beyond the 77% that are currently funded in the province.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. Just before we move on to government business, the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do wish to make three introductions, individuals that are seated in your gallery. I must admit I have a bit of a dilemma. One of the three has instructed me not to introduce her because she feels she's been introduced plenty of times in this House. That person is my mother, and she's sitting in the middle of the three people in your gallery. So I will honor her wishes and not introduce her. Mr. Speaker, seated in your gallery, in addition to my mom, are her brother and my uncle Doug Hubley, who is from Toronto but grew up here in the north end of Halifax. Literally went down the road, moved away in 1961, and I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, at the age of 87 has returned to see our city and our province here. So let's welcome him to the House. And his son, Steve, is also with him, and I'd like the members to just welcome